Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film, and what does the film teach us about the law and the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our film today is Elizabeth the Golden Age, a 2007 movie directed by Shekhar Kapur with a script by William Nicholson and Michael Hurst. The film, a sequel to Kapur's first film, Elizabeth, from 1998, takes place during the latter part of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. The film discusses such things as the plot to assassinate Elizabeth, the arrest and execution of Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, and King Philip II of Spain's attempt to topple Elizabeth and install a Catholic monarch on the English throne, which culminates in England's defeat of Spain in the Spanish Armada of 1588. The film also portrays the complex emotional triangle involving Elizabeth, the English statesman, soldier, and explorer, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth, or Beth Throckmorton, whom Raleigh marries in secret and has a child with. The film also depicts Elizabeth as somewhat enamored with Raleigh. The cast includes Cate Blanchett as Queen Elizabeth I, Clive Owen as Sir Walter Raleigh, Geoffrey Rush as Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, Samantha Morton as Mary Queen of Scots, and Abby Cornish as Beth Throckmorton, and Jordi Molla as Philip II of Spain. In addition to dramatizing this critical and memorable period of English history, albeit with some notable historical changes, the film provides a window into important and timely legal issues around torture, trials for matter of state, and piracy in Tudor England. Our guest today to discuss this film is Alka Pradhan, an expert on the application of human rights and humanitarian law to counterterrorism situations and the impact of torture on fair trials. Alka is currently Human Rights Counsel at the Guantanamo Bay Military Commissions, representing one of the defendants in the capital case of U.S. vs. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called 9/11 case. Alka has also acted as special counsel for the defense at the International Criminal Court and has worked closely with members of the UK Parliament and the European Parliament on official investigations into torture and war crimes. Alka serves as adjunct professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law and is co-chair of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Law Committee. And quite relevant today, Alka is a giant fan and student of Tudor history. Welcome, Alka.
Thank you so much. I think that last part is the most true.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, it's great to be able to talk to you about this movie, which is still quite relevant in some ways. So the film takes place in the latter part of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, and it's the sequel to Kapur's first film, Elizabeth. And the events which take place over the course of a few years, the film concentrates in the year 1585. So what was happening in England then?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm such a Tudor history nerd, and this period is so fascinating to me. So at this point, Elizabeth I has been on the throne for almost 30 years. She's a seasoned diplomat. She's manipulated all of the neighboring kingdoms around her who have had designs on England by promising marriage or promising defensive alliances for a very, very long time, which she needs, right? As a female monarch at a time when really there had been only a few significant female monarchs in the world up until that point. And so she saw the mistakes made by her older sister, Mary, who had married Philip II of Spain during her ill-fated 5 years on the throne. And she was really determined not to make the same mistakes. So the problem, this is just setting the scene really, the problem was that Mary, who ruled immediately before Elizabeth from 1553 to 1558, had essentially been coerced by Philip into implementing the Inquisition in England during those years, which had been sort of like whiplash after the 6 years of their brother Edward's reign, during which Catholics were persecuted. So the divisions in England from those two previous monarchs, leaving out Lady Jane Grey in her 9 days, the divisions, even 27 years or 28 years into Elizabeth's reign, are really, really deep and really festering. And Elizabeth herself had tried for a long time to be more of a religious moderate. I think she famously said something like, "Why must we make windows into men's souls?" But she's also really shrewd, and she's got a cadre of people around her whose job it is to keep their ear to the ground for popular uprisings or anything that could destabilize her, particularly from Catholics. So you mentioned Sir Francis Walsingham, that's her spine master. Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, is her closest advisor. And so with these people sort of handling security matters, she can present herself cleverly as she's the person trying to unite the country, which she's legitimately trying to do, but she needed to appear to be doing as well. And so in the midst of all of this, you've got Philip II of Spain, her old brother-in-law, who's always wanted to control England and has posed a threat really since the day her sister died and Elizabeth was crowned. So that's the milieu of the film.
And the Mary you're referring to is Mary Tudor, not to be confused with the Mary Queen of Scots, who we'll talk about soon, who's central to the film. You also have the Pope, Philip II of Spain, and decades before the film starts, the Catholic monarchs and the Pope look like they're conspiring against Elizabeth, and they want to put a Catholic back on the throne of England, right? So that's a piece of the context too, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest, right? This all started, like Henry VIII started this fight, right? by breaking with Rome because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Like Henry VIII, who had been defender of the faith, he had been defender, like named by the Pope as the most rigorous defender of the Catholic faith when he was younger, then ends up breaking with Rome because he wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon, marry Anne Boleyn. And so he really sets this whole thing in motion. And, you know, everybody saw it. I think all of the Catholic monarchs, and certainly the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, see this as really a blip, and they're looking for an opportunity to bring England back into the fold.
Yeah, and there's a series of plots even before the movie begins, and the one centering around Mary, Queen of Scots, to try to get Elizabeth out. So it's a period of tremendous concern and fears of sabotage and efforts to kind of overrule. So it's a very kind of turbulent period. And so I guess it's kind of the easy question, but what's the value of focusing on this period? Why focus on these few years?
So I can't necessarily speak for Shaker. Also, Shaker, for full disclosure, is my cousin, was married to my cousin for a long time, and he's a wonderful filmmaker. And I was thrilled that he made these films on one of my favorite subjects, although I have nitpicks with some of the aspects of the films. But, you know, I think for Shaker, he really saw the period as, you know, incorporating so much drama and intrigue around Elizabeth, around her romances, which some of which were collapsed into the one that you referenced with Walter Raleigh, how they were parlayed into political capital, the web of family ties. But, you know, for me, the interest of this period is, you know, all of that plus it's during this period of relative peace in England, that you start to see the emergence of a lot of the pillars of what the West now considers to be contribute towards a just society, right? Or at least talked about. So the Renaissance, we always talk about the Renaissance as being relevant to art, but it's a time for ideas, right? That underlays the proliferation of that art. So you see that in bits of this film where you've got the idea of a monarch being subject to the law that's brought up by William Cecil when they're considering what to do with Mary Queen of Scots. And that was written by Edward Cook for the first time, right? The elimination of the use of star chambers. You see the use of the star chamber during this period of time by Elizabeth. And really you see why it should have been eliminated and why it eventually was. And then you see these sort of prominent prosecutions, not just of Mary Queen of Scots, but of wealthy and powerful nobles. And I think that dynamic is always good fodder for drama.
I mean, there's really so much there to dig into at the political level, the personal level. And well, this film certainly underscores that the personal is political in a lot of ways around the court of Elizabeth I. A central piece of the plot is this current attempt to assassinate Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth is Protestant and install a Catholic monarch on the throne. And the plot that the film centers on, so-called the Babington plot, which involved Babington, who was a Catholic nobleman who was conspiring with other Catholic priests or other co-conspirators to try to assassinate Elizabeth. So what happened with this plot in the movie and in real life?
So there's a lot going on. So Philip still wants England, right? Essentially, he's a religious extremist, and he believes that it is his duty to bring England back to Catholicism. So he's sending in spies. He's trying to gain footholds among the nobility in England who might help to destabilize Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's second cousin, she's essentially Elizabeth's sort of niece, She has fled Scotland after being deposed following this whole mess with her second husband, Lord Darnley, who murders her secretary and then ends up being murdered himself. There's a mutiny of her Scottish nobles. She's deposed. She arrives in England in 1567, seeking essentially sanctuary, safety from her cousin, from Elizabeth. It puts Elizabeth in the worst possible position because Mary is a lightning rod for Catholics who believe she should be on the throne of England, right? The blood of the Tudors runs in her veins. And this is not trivial, and Mary is known to be a great beauty, right? And Elizabeth is incredibly insecure. She's vain about her own looks. It's not a minor point because as like co-female monarchs, you can imagine the rivalries in Europe at this time. And at the same time, Elizabeth seems to genuinely care, at least to a certain extent, about the fact that she and Mary are family. And even more that she believes that they both have their thrones by divine right. And so she's just watched Mary being forced to abdicate by Scottish nobles, which is one of her worst nightmares. And now if she calls herself and Mary's sister queens. And so if she now takes action against Mary, she destabilizes her own divine right. And this is the analogy I use most often when I describe President Obama's refusal to pursue real accountability for like the Bush era torture program, right? Because then down the line, following his own presidency, who knows when accountability is going to come for like the drone program or excesses at Gitmo during his time, right? All executive actions by divine right. So like I always have this example in my head.
And she does delay, I think, like 4 months, Elizabeth, after Mary Queen of Scots has been convicted of treason. We'll dial back to that in a second because it's so important. After she's convicted and Parliament's confirmed the conviction, she has to decide on the sentence, and she deliberates for like 4 months before she signs a death warrant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we could talk about it more, but yeah, she goes back and forth. She drives Parliament crazy. She drives her counselors crazy, going back and forth and back and forth. I think legitimately agonizing over this decision.
Just turning to the plot itself, Mary, Queen of Scots, gets involved. So she's like, Mary, Queen of Scots is in England. She's been there at this point for close to 19 years, imprisoned in various places by Elizabeth because Elizabeth's concerned about, and her advisors are concerned about the threat Mary and the people backing Mary pose to her. So she's in towers or sometimes in, I guess, homes, house arrest, but she's basically under lock and key. But then there's this plot that emerges to try to assassinate Elizabeth, and Mary gets tied up in it.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, as soon as Mary crosses the border into England, the alarm is raised among Elizabeth's advisors, and they start monitoring her correspondence. They keep her under lock and key. And the way they actually finally get her is by intercepting her letters. And there is some, and we can come back to this, but there is some dispute over the veracity of all of those letters. I think it's clear that some of them are legitimate. It's not clear that all of them were. There's a lot of dispute about it. But Walsingham essentially has a mole in the French embassy who is slipping him the correspondence between Mary and a group of conspirators associated with the Babington plot.
And so they uncover the plot and arrest Mary. Now, you talked about Walsingham, who's a key character in the movie, played by Geoffrey Rush. He's sort of like a composite of a few of Elizabeth's top officials, but he's one of them. And he uncovers the plot through the intercept of letters. And are there other ways that he gathers information? I mean, the film looks at some of the interrogations.
Yeah, exactly. So he starts with this monitoring of correspondence. And the reason actually that Mary has moved around so much during those 19 years in England is because there's this real fear and suspicion that each time she gets somewhere, her captors either fall in love with her or become sympathetic to her. And so they have to keep kind of moving her around to satisfy themselves that she's actually secure. So monitoring her correspondence is one of these ways in which they kind of keep an eye on her. And Walsingham, I think, has evidence from very early on through these letters that she is at least corresponding with people who are known to be Catholic, who are known to be kind of troublemakers. But Babington is a nobleman, right? So you can't just go after nobility or a former queen without a certain amount of evidence. And so he plays a long game and monitors this correspondence for a very, very long time. until finally he ends up capturing, I think the first person he captures is John Ballard, who was a Catholic priest who was one of the correspondents, along with Anthony Babington. And Ballard was, I believe, the first person arrested and sort of disappeared and then tortured. And that was the beginning of a number of tortured interrogations of Babington plotters that then led to the arrest of Mary.
And the film kind of comes right down to the moment, like they have Babington holding the pistol at Elizabeth, and I think it's not loaded or he doesn't fire. Although I think the plot was stopped much earlier on, right? I don't think it got to that.
Yeah, it never got to that point, but it was a plot that involved not just the deposition of the deposement. I've been in depositions, the deposement of Elizabeth, but her death as well, right? Which is why it was so serious. But yeah, it was disrupted much earlier. Babington never had an opportunity to hold up a gun.
And the letters were important in gathering the evidence, and also, I think, for Walsingham to be able to convince Elizabeth to move ahead and finally arrest Mary, because she was hesitant to do that. It was sort of like proof for whatever form of trial they had, which was very limited, but also to make Elizabeth go ahead and arrest Mary.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they needed words in her own writing, right? They needed her own words to work against her. And, interestingly, one of her, and I'm sure we'll talk about the trial, but one of her defenses is like, look, I never called for the death of my cousin. I wouldn't do something like that, which is technically true. None of the letters, whether real or not, say, yes, please kill my cousin. But what they do say are things like, now get the 6 men to work, or let the plot go forward, essentially. Variations of that, which means that she was at least aware, if they're true, she was at least aware of the plot and would have known that it involved the death of her cousin.
Yeah, I think the language from one of the letters is, then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work, taking order upon the accomplishment of their design, much as what you said, more clearly than in the 16th century English syntax. Yeah, they're not like, let's go kill Elizabeth, but definitely a plot against her, and the natural outcome would likely be that Elizabeth would be killed. Well, before we go to the trial, I guess maybe a little bit more on torture, which you mentioned and you've worked so much on at Guantanamo and elsewhere. How important was that to gathering information, and how was it treated at the time? It's shown a little bit in the film.
So torture is huge during this era. We'll talk about how cruel Henry VIII was, and we comparatively this era of like light and love ushered in by Elizabeth. But what Shaker's films on this, both films, really get right is this tremendous feeling, and you alluded to it earlier, of instability and I think rightful paranoia, like that was felt at the top by Elizabeth and her Privy Council. And this manifests under Elizabeth's reign as the highest number of torture warrants issued by any single monarch in English history. And how this plays out first with regards to the Babington plot is so that priest, John Ballard, he spends years corresponding with Mary, the letters are intercepted, and then Ballard, is arrested and tortured. And under torture, he names several other members of the plot, including Babington, and the noose closes in on them. And poor John Ballard, I think according to the contemporaneous reports, had his arms hanging out of their sockets by the time he was brought for execution because of the use of the rack. Torture was outlawed by the Magna Carta, right? Like it had been outlawed for a really long time at this point, except by royal warrant. Because divine right and all of that, they have the right to issue these warrants allowing for exceptions to the prohibition on torture. And so I always think it's really funny, sitting here in 2023 when we talk about this eternal debate of does torture work and should we torture people and should there be exceptions? Back in the 1200s, they outlawed torture for all of the reasons we now know today. It doesn't work. It is morally wrong, all of those. But there was this one exception in the 1500s. And so Henry VIII had implemented a decent amount of torture, particularly in connection with getting rid of the wives and the subsequent sort of religious turmoil from creating his own church. Edward and Mary, his son and then older daughter, had relatively few torture warrants issued. Although Mary's reign really was kind of systematic terror against Protestants. But Elizabeth's torture warrants surpassed all of them. I think there are currently about, and I know this because I've gone and looked at them, there are currently about 80 English torture warrants still existing today. I'm not sure how many there were at one point, but of those 80s, more than 50 of them are Elizabethan, which speaks to how disproportionate this was. And the warrant system is really interesting, actually. Like the warrant could only be issued if there was already I think the phrase is a vehement suspicion of guilt. makes you kind of wonder why they would necessarily need it. But that was when the warrant could be issued. And then a report had to be made directly to the monarch. Once they asked for the warrant, a report had to be made of the statements made before torture, the statements made during torture, and then the statements made after torture. And then they would, figure out what they wanted to use from that. It's super interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting the way it was sort of allowed but regulated all within the crown. Unlike some of the more modern proposals for torture warrants, there was no judicial involvement. It was just all done within the queen and her council.
Yeah, we were still at sort of the apex of the divine right? I mean, I guess Louis the 14th comes a little bit later, but we're still kind of at this high water mark for that. And then it all goes downhill for the monarchies of Europe after that.
And I wonder if the uptick in the torture warrants in the Elizabethan age was in part due to the incredible instability and the various threats to the crown. And while there was a recognition of the problematic nature of torture practically and morally, the officials seemed compelled to use it. Certainly, there were fewer ways than we have today to gather information. I mean, the modern forms of surveillance were not around, although there were some forms of human intelligence they sent to get with people cooperating or going effectively undercover. Did that happen as well?
Yeah, you had a whole spy network was established by Walsingham. It was really the most sophisticated spy network in Europe. And it was all born out of this fact that England felt like it was the most vulnerable country in Europe, in part because it was surrounded by Catholic states. I mean, even France and Spain, these two behemoths. You had Germany, right, that was turning Protestant, had a lot of Protestants, but France, Spain, Italy, the Pope's coming for you. It's totally understandable that they would feel threatened. So Walsingham's spy network, involving human intelligence was really very, very sophisticated. But you still see this idea of confession as evidence, right? Like nothing's compared to the confession, which is a problem we still have today, that confessions are seen as the be all and end all. And it doesn't matter what other evidence you have, you got a confession, that's kind of a done deal.
Yeah, so it's really until that's not the focus of the evidence that you really can get some of the real ending of the use of torture. But that's seen as the most, and still is in some countries, the most valuable piece of evidence, the confession, and that's just going to incentivize torture because it's very good at producing confessions. Problem is, they're often false.
That's the problem. There's just no reliability, right? I mean, the last known torture warrant is from 1642 in England. And I think there's a real understanding by this point, probably from some of that documentation before, during, and after torture, that the statements taken during torture, right? Some of them might be true. It's not to say that no true statements come out during torture, but they just can't be relied upon because so much untrue stuff comes out during torture as well. So it's not to say that nobody was tortured after that date, but official sanction for it appears to have ended by then, which is very shortly after Elizabeth dies and we start moving into the English Civil War era.
Yeah, just one more point on Walsingham for his fascinating character. Again, I think he's like a composite of Cecil and perhaps others, but he's referred to his position as he's Secretary of State. He's also they frequently referred to him in the film and throughout the literature as the spy master, which I found, very interesting, that network of counterintelligence and surveillance that was operating within England in the Tudor period.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating character. And I think there's actually an entire book, I think, on him called Spy Master or something similar to that. We see him as a main character in a lot of books and films about Elizabeth, just because the apparatus that he managed to put in place at the behest of Cecil and these other prominent privy counselors, but it was really his brainchild, right? Really rivaled some of the stuff that Thomas Cromwell did for Henry VIII, a generation before that, but built on it and used a system of incentives and threats to get people to inform on each other. I think it probably backfired in ways because it probably contributed to this sense of instability that the people felt, those divisions that we talked about before between Protestants and Catholics. If you could never feel like you could speak your mind because your neighbor was going to rat on you to Walsingham, then how safe do you really feel?
So another central event in the film takes place off screen, just to turn to the trial of Mary Queen of Scots, which takes place in 1586. So they show her being arrested. They show Mary being arrested in the movie, and then they show the execution scene. So what was Mary tried for and how was the trial conducted?
So she's tried for treason, which is really interesting because she's obviously formerly queen of another country. She's being tried for treason in England against her cousin, the queen there. And the trial wasn't really a trial. Sorry to shake her, but I felt so cheated by the fact that this trial wasn't even shown as like an aside in the film. It is such a dramatic high point. Rather than a trial, it's more of a commission. Essentially, Elizabeth said, do it however you want to do it. But, I think she said, added for posterity, do it fairly. And so what ended up happening is there's a commission established. Stop me if this sounds familiar, but there's a commission established. Like everything comes back to Gitmo. Like 36 commissioners, right? All male noblemen, English male noblemen, who are set essentially to examine the evidence and on behalf of the Queen. There is a subset of commissioners that are supposed to like sort of act for Mary, but Mary is not allowed to have a lawyer. Nobody acting on her behalf, nor her, are allowed to examine the evidence, including those letters, including those confessions. There's actually a fascinating, I think, contemporaneous drawing of the commission, which shows kind of the scribes in the middle and the noblemen on all sides, with an empty throne at one end that is supposed to represent the monarch. That's for Elizabeth, who scrupulously stayed away from this whole thing. And then Mary being brought in and facing this group of men. And it is such a dramatic high point between a deposed queen, a divine figure at that time, a formerly powerful woman, and a group of men seeking to hold her accountable, but also just trying to stitch her up, right, for their own political ends. So these are people who could have ended up being her subjects in another version of reality. And so the various dynamics are just incredible. I think we should write like a play or something just about this trial at some point when neither of us is busy.
It does seem like a missed opportunity to show at least some of what's happening. I mean, it sounded like procedurally just beyond flawed. Like they didn't even show her the letters so that she could respond to. I mean, as a key element, like counsel, just fundamental safeguards weren't there.
Yeah. I mean, she argues, look, you don't have jurisdiction over me. I'm not an English subject, first of all. If I were an English subject, I'd be in a real court, which again, stop me if this sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I'm a queen. Ergo, you have no right to try me at all. She's not allowed to call any witnesses. She's not allowed to examine any of the documents being used against her. She says she's innocent. And then, they bring forward these confessions from Babington and Mary's secretaries. These are all obtained via torture. And then a couple of her letters talking about the support for the plot, which we've just talked about. And so they have this hearing where she's acting on her own behalf. Like she is sitting there doing battle by herself against this row of gentlemen. And there's a heated debate. The hearing finishes. And then suddenly Elizabeth says, hey, you need to re-adjourn this to London. We're not sure why, but essentially after Mary is heard, they leave her at Fotheringay Castle up in the north. And they all head back to the Star Chamber in London to finish the trial without her. And the trial is finished and no one tells her that it's done or what happened. I mean, you can imagine how this all plays in my head while we're sitting in like the military commission courtroom at Gitmo, right?
Yeah, because there's often reference to the Star Chamber-like quality, but this is a really good illustration. We'll leave you in the castle where she's ultimately executed, right? And we'll come back and we'll finish the proceedings without you.
Yeah.
It's kind of just amazing. The procedural flaws are just obvious and would be clear as day now. No lawyer, no ability to see the evidence.
One would think that he is
there. Yeah, but the legal ones are interesting too, right? She was Queen of France first, right? And then Scotland and not a subject. So she has sort of like legal immunity defenses, or that you can't be convicted of treason if she didn't know duty of loyalty. So it's a really fascinating set of circumstances. It does sound like that is ripe for a full treatment.
Absolutely. I think, like witness for the prosecution or, 12 Angry Men or, somebody should do just this film.
We need a Henry Fonda in the jury to, but so this is a significant event. Legally, this cements, presumably, Elizabeth's power, eliminates one threat. I mean, there's still another threat we can get to coming from Spain, and it's just a very important event. Mary is sentenced to death, and you see in the film Elizabeth upset about it, although it seems she's more personally upset than she is concerned about, do I want to sign this death warrant because that might unite the other monarchs against me and maybe it'll be my head on the chopping block next time. Do you think it's more the personal or the political? What's your take?
You know what? I think everything we read from Elizabeth at that time, like her correspondence and all the contemporaneous accounts, like I think it is a really inseparable mix of all of those things. I think Elizabeth is terrified. She's always been unstable. This is just like literally the worst decision she has ever had to make on a personal level and a political level. There is that fear of retaliation from the other monarchs. She's been holding Spain at bay for a long time. France, Catherine de' Medici has always been really hostile. Spain's at the back door with the Armada. They're already mad about the pirates and plunder and taking bits of America and all of that. And so it takes her months, like 4 months, during which the verdict is issued by the commission. And of course, she's found guilty of treason. And then Parliament ratifies that immediately. So you've got essentially her entire government against her saying, sign the warrant, sign the warrant, sign the warrant, sign the warrant every single day. And she holds out for like 4 months, going back and forth and back and forth. But she's smart, right? Elizabeth is nothing if not like throughout her whole life, whether you love her or hate her, whatever, she's a survivor. And so I think once it became clear that she couldn't avoid executing Mary, I think she held out in part because once they executed the rest of the Babington plotters, she thought maybe that might satisfy everybody, and it didn't. It was very clear that it didn't. Like they wanted Mary dead. So once it became clear she couldn't avoid that, I think she tried to engineer it. So at the very least, she could have plausible deniability about giving the order. So she signs the warrant. She tells the Lord Chancellor not to execute the warrant without her say so. But then at that point, everyone is afraid she's going to change her mind again. And once she signs it, they can legally go forward. So she signs it, she puts her seal on it. And before she can change her mind, they like run it up on a horse to Fotheringay Castle and carry out this really gruesome execution of Mary Queen of Scots. So it's still not clear whether she legitimately wanted them to wait or whether she just wanted the cover, which I think is really well done on her part, that with 470, 80 years later, we still aren't quite clear.
What she was planning to do. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then they have the body right embalmed. Is that right? It's embalmed in a coffin. It gets exhumed in 1612. Mary, Queen of Scots' son, who's then King James I, who moves it to opposite Elizabeth's in Westminster Abbey. So I guess they're kind of together in a way in posterity.
Yeah, it's, you know what, the whole thing about Westminster Abbey, for everybody who's been, will understand how weird the placement of the queens is, in part by design. But like Mary the First, Bloody Mary, Catholic Mary, who preceded Elizabeth, her half sister, is buried together in the same tomb with Elizabeth, right? The child of Catherine of Aragon and the child of Anne Boleyn are buried together. And then opposite them is Mary Queen of Scots, who's succeeded by Elizabeth the First. It's just such a weird manipulation of these three queens who were really interesting figures in their own time, probably deserved their own tombs.
Yeah, they were all kind of deal with the past in a certain way and now move forward in this English nationalism. Yeah, it's so interesting. So another central event is the destruction of the Spanish Armada, which takes place, in fact, in 1588, a year after Mary's execution. And this is a important historical event. I think they still maybe teach it in school, or, sort of a central event in European history associated with ascent of England on the world stage and the slow beginning of Spanish decline.
My lords, I can offer you no words of comfort. This armada that sails against us carries in its bowels the Inquisition. God forbid it succeeds, for then there will be no more liberty in England, of conscience or of thought. We cannot be defeated.
Can you talk about the event and how it's depicted in the film?
Yeah. So as I said, England's been kind of nibbling at Spain for a while. Like Spain's posing this huge threat at the back door for 50 years on England. But meanwhile, you've got Walter Raleigh and his sea dogs, right? These sort of pirates turned privateers. We're going to talk about that whole thing, that have been attacking Spanish ships for plunder. They've also gotten a foothold in America. They've established Virginia, which is named, of course, for the Virgin Queen, for Elizabeth I. And then Philip, in the meantime, is getting older and sicker and more extremist in his views. And so the launch of the Armada in 1588 is meant to be a final death blow by Philip to Elizabeth's reign. Reinstate Catholicism, put an end to English dominance, not really dominance, but English emergence or threat to Spain on the seas. And instead, you end up having what has been sort of under historical revisionism written as sort of a David and Goliath story, right? You've got these little English ships that are, smaller but more mobile, which is true. And these big hulking Spanish ships that can't move around easily and can't keep up with, the little English gunboats, all of which is true. But really what tanked the Spanish Armada was terrible weather for Spain, both on their way to and on their way back from fighting England. I think they may have actually tried to reattack, but for the English Navy, in a really brilliant strategic move, forced them to go all the way up around Scotland. And by the time they made it back down, were so destroyed that they were, they're limping home. And at this point, word has gotten out that England has the most lauded navy in the world. I think it ushers in this age of thinking about the English Navy as this incredible force that leads to the rise of colonialism and all of that. But England, at that point, the balance starts to shift between England and Spain on the sea.
And the film depicts the battle very colorfully, and it omits Sir Francis Drake, unfortunately, who was, I think, central to the battle, and Raleigh was, I believe, fighting on land at the time. But one other point, which just to go back to something you said, is the way it's sequenced in the film, it looks like it's a direct response to Mary's execution. Philip goes in, and he's going to put his daughter, Isabella, on the throne if he wins. But I think some historians point to some of the other forces that you talked about, and you referenced England's policy of piracy against Spanish ships, which were returning with riches from the New World, and England had ordered a tax on those ships as a precipitating cause. So can you talk about that sort of historical aspect of the Spanish Armada and just generally about piracy at the time?
Piracy is, I don't want to say fun, right? Because it is a high crime, but the conception and manipulation of piracy at this time is really, really interesting because, pirates are pirates. Pirates are, these people on ships who take over, they seize ships and its cargo from their lawful owners, and they're generally considered to be rogues and criminals. And particularly when they interrupt their own country's shipping, right? Like you hijack an English ship and take the stuff, your country's going to hate you. But it started with Henry VIII, but under Elizabeth in particular, English pirates are sort of conferred with hero status, like patriot status, when their plunder is of enemies of the crown. And so Elizabeth starts making this weird, highly suspect legal distinction between piracy and privateering. And you sort of see the rise of this concept of privateering, which basically gives ships to people known as pirates. And, they're privately owned armed ships that are commissioned by the crown, right? And you get a letter of marque from the crown saying that you can capture enemy ships in a time of declared war. And sort of similar to our war on terror, there's this amorphous war with Spain going on at the time. And so Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh are given these letters of marque by Elizabeth to plunder the Spanish ships on the condition that they bring back the plunder. They're given a generous share of it, but then it goes towards the crown. And that's how England funds this war with the Spanish Armada in 1588. By then, they've accumulated a decent amount of Spanish plunder. And so this is all extremely legally suspect. There is really no distinction between privateering and piracy, but it gives the crown a little bit of control and allows them to put their stamp on what was up until then just a completely lawless act.
Well, just to go back to Walter Raleigh for a second, and there's piracy privateering thing in here, I think, as well. A central subplot of the film deals with the triangular relationship between Raleigh, Elizabeth, and Beth Throckmorton, Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting, who Raleigh marries secretly and has a child with. The film has this taking place, I think, before the Armada. Apparently, it took place 3 years afterwards. What's your take on the depiction of the film and also what happened between the three of them?
I understand when you're making a film, you have to collapse some characters, but that part of it did bug me a little bit because there are a number of really significant men around Elizabeth who play both like dual roles, romantic and political. Walter Raleigh is significant on a political level, but there's really very little evidence that Elizabeth was interested in him romantically. And so what sort of ended up happening is he's being conflated with the Earl of Leicester, who was like her longtime love. She'd been imprisoned in the Tower with when they were children during the reign of Mary. He's been conflated a little bit with Sir Christopher Hatton, who's her Lord Chancellor, who she did have a little flirtation with. He's been conflated with Robert Essex, who is kind of this volatile man about court who falls in love with Elizabeth. She falls in love with him. He's much younger. And then he ends up turning on her and leading a rebellion against her. So, all of that, obviously you could make a film about each one of those, but it's really exaggerated, I think, her interest in Walter Raleigh. I mean, I don't blame, when you've got Clive Owen playing the part, right? You really want to maximize it.
Like a Errol Flynn-like role, exactly. So
exactly, right? Oh, he's a good-looking guy. Everybody wants to see more of him. I get it. I do.
It's a fascinating character in his own right, but the film, it takes some significant liberties. What's accurate, though, right, was generally, at least, Raleigh did have the relationship, the child, and marries Throckmorton, Beth Throckmorton, and they both are imprisoned as a result of that. It's interesting because they didn't get her permission, and for Throckmorton, the absolute duty of loyalty that she could not marry without getting the monarch's permission.
Yeah. And I mean, because she was a lady in waiting, right? That was the rule. But Elizabeth imposed that rule on the men in her life as well, who she did have a romantic interest in. I mean, famously, Robert Dudley, right? The Earl of Leicester, the one who'd been imprisoned with her, she was in love with him for most of her life until his death. And he was married once. His wife mysteriously died, was most likely murdered by him because he thought he saw an opportunity to marry Elizabeth. But his second marriage was to one of Elizabeth's cousins, and it was done in secret. And when she found out about it, she banished both of them for, I think, at least a year, maybe 2, and then accepted him back, but kept her cousin banned from court for the rest of her life. Everybody at the time commented on how excessive it was. I mean, this was literally her blood cousin, this woman who was banned from court for the rest of her life.
So what do you attribute then the treatment of Beth Throckmorton being imprisoned to, if there wasn't really this strong feeling, romantic feeling that Elizabeth had towards Raleigh that made her jealous?
Well, the issue is that Beth Throckmorton was related to Elizabeth, right? Most of the ladies in waiting usually came from the royal family. And they did that not just because they were high ranking, but because the queen could keep them close. And she had to give permission for them to get married because she had to make sure that the marriages were not just like politically advantageous for her and also at a certain rank for her kinswomen, but also would not result in a child that would threaten her reign, right? Because you're trying to juggle like Plantagenet heirs and Tudor heirs, and it's all over the place at this point. So that was really Bess's real crime, if you will, right? To the extent that there was a crime. Elizabeth was genuinely fond of her as well, but that was the real transgression, is that she was a kinswoman of the queen who did not ask permission before she got married and got pregnant.
Yeah, and so she and Raleigh both are imprisoned. Throckmorton is released after her baby dies of the plague, and Raleigh, take it back to the piracy example, he's released because one of the expeditions had returned from England with a ship with a lot of Spanish gold. The crew was going to mutiny.
Yeah, exactly. It does illustrate really well, like one of Elizabeth's tactics, which was to keep any threats or people who displeased her just separate from everyone else, right? She did that with Leicester and his wife, her cousin. She did that with Raleigh and Beth Throckmorton. Like Bess is released, but Raleigh is basically sent away, right? He's sent out, back on his ships away from Beth Throckmorton. So she basically takes, I don't want to say takes great pleasure, but that is a mode of protecting herself. Like she keeps anyone who has wronged her, she keeps them separate from each other.
Yeah, it just feels like it's a constant management of intrigue.
Yeah, completely. I mean, which, it makes some sense given the way she grew up, right? As, her mother is beheaded when she's like 2.5 years old. She has a somewhat close relationship with her half sister, Mary, for a time, and then they're pitted against each other. And then all of this terrible stuff happens with her father dying, and she's thrown in at first close to her little brother, tries to advise him. He turns into a religious bigot. Then Mary's on the throne, and she institutes the Inquisition and puts Elizabeth in jail, and then Elizabeth is released and is like, what do I do with this country? So the paranoia and this tendency to kind of divide, I think it makes a lot of sense given her psychology.
And Raleigh himself is ultimately executed by the next monarch, right?
Yeah, Raleigh just eventually just goes too far. Like Raleigh, he's known for being just this really cocky character, right? He brings home all this plunder. He's hailed as a hero. But, James the First is not as enamored of Raleigh as Elizabeth was. James the First, of course, and his son Charles were much more sympathetic towards Catholics. So that played a little bit of a role in the dynamic as well. But yeah, Raleigh eventually he's thrown in jail and he conspires one too many times and is eventually executed.
Well, just to go back to torture for a second, which is such an important part of your work and a significant part of the film. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the techniques that were used at the time?
Yeah. So you hear a lot during this time about the use of the rack, which was that was what was done to John Ballard, where your hands and legs are kind of pulled out of their sockets. But aside from that, you've got a lot of techniques that, our modern day torturers, people like John Yoo and James Mitchell would recognize immediately. So you've got the use of manacles, which was like standing sleep deprivation. So your wrists are shackled above your head so high that you can't stand properly on your feet. You're kind of unbalanced and you can't put your weight down. So my client Amar was shackled like that with his arms above his head when he was at Site Cobalt in CIA detention. There's something called, we think it was in the Tower of London, something called the Little Ease, which is a cell that's so small that you can't stand or sit or really move, right? It's just incredibly horrific to think about. And that honestly is similar to the confinement box that Abu Zubaydah was put in early in his detention during CIA custody. So I just think it's so interesting how we keep coming back to this question of torture and, sort of agonizing over whether does it work? Does it work? Of course it doesn't work. But we also seem to have very limited imagination in how we torture fellow human beings. I mean, knowing that these things don't work, watching them over time, seeing them in movies, right? And thinking to ourselves, this is so inhumane. This is so brutal. I can't believe they did that back then. And here we are today still debating over essentially the same techniques. It's slightly demoralizing.
Yeah, it is. And the film, while it shows it sort of, I don't think it attempts to make the audience particularly uncomfortable. I don't know if you agree. It's just sort of like kind of part of the story. It's just sort of unquestioned use. And in fairness, it was used at the time, so it's being historically accurate in that larger sense. But it's just sort of incidental to the film and all the different things, like the unfair trial of Mary Queen of Scots. I mean, they're all sort of put to the larger narrative of Elizabeth concentrating her power, eliminating her enemies, and England rising as this preeminent power.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's really what bothered me is that, obviously given like what we do at Guantanamo, like it's very difficult for me to watch depictions of torture. You probably understand why, but I'm not opposed to depicting it in a certain way because I think that sometimes showing the brutality of it can shock people enough, right? That you get that outrage. But I will say, I don't think I've ever really seen it properly done, except maybe one film that came sort of close was The Report. But films like, look, this film, Zero Dark 30, right, that show it kind of disconnected from humanity in a way that makes it look useful almost, right, is something that I find like just hugely problematic. Because then you start having that debate again in your head about expediency, about, efficacy. And the reality is just so much more complex than that and leads you to the opposite conclusion, right, when faced with the facts.
I agree. And especially something like Zero Dark 30, where that's a sort of a didactic point of the movie. I mean, it's intending to, in a sense, take a position almost on the issue. I think this is just telling it as part of the story, but not critical about it as it does.
Yeah, exactly. And we're at a point now, I think, where that's not acceptable. Like glorification of torture is not acceptable, but also showing it for entertainment purposes without taking a clear position against it is also not acceptable. I think we're just past that point.
So anything else you want to say about the film or your impressions of this film? You're a deep expert, not just in human rights issues on torture and detention, but in Tudor history.
I love this film not just because it makes you think a little bit, but films like this can, if you let them, if you do a little more digging and understand that, a film is not necessarily history, but can lead us towards history. I think it has the ability to hold up a mirror a little bit to us. Like, look at the circumstances around the takedown of Mary. And you look at the Guantanamo Military Commission now, can't confront the evidence. You can't really challenge the validity of the evidence. You're using torture-derived evidence. It's specifically constituted for a small group of Muslim men, specifically constituted for this one woman, French, Scottish, English woman. It's not clear that there's jurisdiction, right? Like, you look at that and if you allow yourself to be curious, to investigate these sort of historical bases, it raises questions about how far we've really come, but it also presents some of the ways in which we can improve. So I don't know. I think you can look at films like this optimistically and find lessons in them in addition to just being entertained by the drama.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the relationships and everything else, and the period costumes, which are great, I think the way the kind of political nature of the trial and trials for security of state is fascinating. And a lot of this happens, as we we're talking about, in the kind of period not that long before the start of the great beginnings of English history with the Glorious Revolution and the English Constitution and all these other things and what was going on, the outlawing of the Star Chamber and the like. But just the political nature of the trial, which, as we said, was unfortunately off screen. But I think that you really could have a great trial just around the trial of Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have to write it at some point.
Yeah, if it's right, if it's not out there, we'll have to create it. Well, Alka, I just want to thank you again for coming on and sharing your experience and enthusiasm for this fascinating subject. So much appreciated.
No, listen, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be in your pantheon of awesome people who have talked about films.
Thanks again.
Of course. Thank you.